Welcome back, everyone. Today, we're diving into some, well, heavy stuff. The aftermath of Hurricane Helene.
Right.
We're not just talking about wind speeds and rainfall here, but about the human cost, the money it'll take to rebuild, and the political hurdles. Well, they always seem to come up, right?
Yeah, that's right. With a disaster this big, it's easy to get lost in the numbers. But Helene's impact, well, it goes way beyond property damage.
Right.
We're talking over 200 lives lost, families who've lost their homes, entire communities just shattered. The storm, it tore through multiple states, leaving behind damage, devastation, really, that's going to take years to recover from.
It's heartbreaking, especially seeing those images coming out of the affected areas. And the
Mhm.
fact that, like you said, it tore through multiple states, that's got to make the recovery efforts even harder, don't you think?
Absolutely.
It's not like a single town or anything.
This is something we really need to grasp. The sheer scale of this disaster. It's not just about rebuilding homes in one town. It's about rebuilding infrastructure, entire economies and lives
Hmm.
across multiple states.
Right.
And the financial burden alone is immense. And that's before you even factor in the long-term costs, economic and psychological, that linger long after the initial cleanup.
Okay, so a massive recovery effort on a multi-state level. That brings us to FEMA, right? They're the ones who handle most of this disaster relief funding, right? But I'm already getting the sense that things might not be so straightforward.
You're picking up on something important. FEMA operates on a budget.
Mm-hmm.
And while they did get a $20 billion boost recently, that money doesn't just sit around waiting for the next disaster.
Right.
A big chunk of it was already earmarked for previous events, like the wildfires and the Midwest flooding. It's like having a savings account, but every time something bad happens, you have to dip into it.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it like that. So even with that big influx of cash, they're still playing catch up.
Exactly. And this is where Hurricane Helene throws a real wrench into the works. FEMA official Frank Matranga even went on record calling it a very expensive disaster, and he wasn't exaggerating. The early estimates are already pointing to a massive funding gap between what's available and what's actually needed.
So we've got the situation where the need is urgent, the scale is massive, and the resources, well, they might seem big, but they're already stretched thin. What happens next? Who bridges that funding gap? Where does the money even come from?
That's the million-dollar question. And unfortunately, it's not just about crunching numbers and finding more money. This is where the conversation turns to Washington, D.C. And with hurricane season far from over, things could get very complicated very quickly.
I think you're right, because whenever we're talking about large sums of money, especially government money, there's always a political dimension to it. So let's unpack that, because I have a feeling this is where things get really interesting. So we've got this, well, this perfect storm brewing, right? A massive need for aid after Helene, FEMA's budget. It's already stretched thin. This has got to be causing some serious tension in Washington.
Oh, absolutely. It's like watching a political thriller in slow motion. On one hand, you've got President Biden, and he's hinting that he might call Congress back for an emergency session just to deal with FEMA funding. That sense of urgency, right? The possibility of disrupting everyone's schedules, it speaks volumes.
And on the other hand, because I can't imagine everyone's on board with an emergency session. Those aren't exactly a picnic, right?
Not even close.
Yeah.
And that's where House Speaker Mike Johnson comes in. He's been pretty vocal, actually, about seeing no need to rush back.
Yeah.
His argument seems to be that Congress, well, they already did their part by approving that $20 billion, so, what's the big hurry?
Which, to be fair, it does sound like a lot of money to the average person. But we just talked about how much of that's already been spent, right?
Exactly. Classic case of optics versus reality. And this is where things get interesting. It's not just a two-sided standoff between the White House and House leadership. You've got a bipartisan group of senators from the states hit hardest by Helene. And they're essentially saying, hold up, we need to be ready to act and fast.
Right. They're the ones who are really feeling the pressure right now. I imagine those phone calls to their offices are pretty intense right now.
Absolutely. They're getting an earful from their constituents, seeing the devastation firsthand. And they're not being shy about pushing back against any perceived inaction. Senator Rick Scott from Florida, for example, didn't mince words.
Right.
He straight up called for the Senate to immediately reconvene
Yeah.
to pass a supplemental aid package for FEMA.
Immediately is doing a lot of work in that sentence. He's not letting up on the gas at all.
Not one bit. And remember, this is coming from a Republican senator working across the aisle with Democrats from other impacted states. When you see that kind of unity, that sense of urgency that goes beyond party lines, you know it's serious.
It definitely feels like there's more at play here than just a disagreement over a few $1 billion. It feels like this is just the tip of the iceberg, especially with a potential government shutdown looming.
You hit the nail on the head. What we're seeing with Hurricane Helene, it's almost a microcosm of the larger budget battles that constantly play out in D.C. Disaster relief, unfortunately, often becomes a pawn in these bigger games of political chess.
Okay, so help me understand this. How does disaster relief, something that seems so urgent and essential, get caught up in these political power struggle?
Well, take Senator Lindsey Graham, for example. He's been a vocal advocate for hurricane relief, but he's also used this opportunity to push for increased funding for Israel's missile defense system.
Wait, so he's connecting hurricane relief in the U.S. to funding for Israel's military? How does he even make that connection?
He argues that both are critical national security priorities,
Hmm.
that we need to be prepared on all fronts. So it's a strategic move, bundling these two seemingly totally different issues together.
That's fascinating. So it's not just about saying yes or no to hurricane relief. It's about using the situation to advance other agendas.
You're catching on. And this is where things get really complex, because now you've got to consider not just the needs of those affected by the hurricane, but also the political calculations, the potential trade-offs, the domestic and international implications.
It's like trying to solve a Rubik's Cube while blindfolded and riding a unicycle. No wonder this stuff is so hard to follow. But it sounds like the American people, the voters, might have a bigger role to play in all of this than we realize.
Absolutely. And that's what makes the next few weeks so crucial. How this funding debate plays out, who benefits, who loses out. It's not just about numbers on a spreadsheet. It's about priorities, values, and the very soul of how we respond to crises.
So where do we go from here? What are the potential scenarios we might see play out?
That's the million-dollar question, and it all comes down to,
So where do we go from here? What are the potential scenarios we might see play out?
that's the million-dollar question. And it all comes down to, well, public pressure and how this whole thing is framed in the media.
Right.
Remember those senators we talked about?
Right.
The ones pushing for immediate action. Their power, it comes from amplifying the voices of their constituents, the people directly impacted by Helene.
Right, because it's one thing for politicians to debate budget numbers in the abstract, but it's much harder to ignore the faces of those who've lost everything. That's where public awareness is so important, isn't it?
Absolutely. The more attention this crisis gets, the harder it becomes for lawmakers to just do nothing or to treat disaster relief like, some kind of bargaining chip. It's about changing the narrative from a political football to a human story.
So are we talking about the power of news coverage, social media campaigns, things like that? Because honestly, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by all the information out there. How can people actually make a difference?
That's the challenge, right? Cutting through the noise. It's about, well, focusing on those personal stories. Think about the families who are struggling to rebuild, the businesses that are shuttered, the communities that are dealing with the long-term effects of this storm. Those are the stories that really make people listen, that put pressure on lawmakers to act.
It's about connecting those big policy decisions to the real-world impact on people's lives. So what can our listeners do? Where do we even begin with something this complex?
It starts with staying informed, educating yourself about what's going on.
Hmm.
You're already doing that by listening to this deep dive.
Right.
Then talk about it. Share those stories with your friends, your family, your social media. Contact your elected officials. Let them know that this matters to you.
Right. Don't underestimate the power of making your voice heard. It might feel small, but it all adds up.
Exactly. And remember, this isn't just about Hurricane Helene. This is about how we as a nation respond to crises, how we prioritize our resources and who we choose to help when something like this happens. These are important conversations to have even after the headlines fade.
It's a lot to think about, but I think we've covered some important ground today. To our listeners, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay informed, stay engaged, and keep asking those tough questions. Until next time, we'll keep digging for you.